Something happened just yesterday that most Americans either didn't hear about or heard about in a way that stripped out the most important parts. In Islamabad, Pakistan, for the first time since 2015, American and Iranian officials sat across from each other, face to face, in what was supposed to be the conversation that ended a war. Vice President J.D. Vance flew in. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi was there. Pakistan's entire diplomatic apparatus was mobilized. The city was locked down with thousands of troops lining the streets, and for 21 hours, two sides that had been bombing each other for 6 weeks tried to find a way out of a conflict that is reshaping the entire geopolitical architecture of our world, and they failed. Vance walked out and said plainly, "The bad news is that we have not reached an agreement, and I think that's bad news for Iran much more than it's bad news for the US. They have chosen not to accept our terms." Within hours, Trump announced on Truth Social that the US Navy would begin blockading the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most critical shipping routes, saying Iran would not be allowed to profit from what he called an illegal act of extortion. Now, here is what you need to understand. This is not a story about a failed negotiation. This is a story about the collision of two completely different visions of how power works, who gets to hold it, and what the future of the Middle East, and frankly the world, is going to look like. And whatever side of the political aisle you sit on, what is happening right now has consequences for your gas bill, your grocery prices, your kids' future, and the kind of country America is going to be when this is all over. Let's start from the beginning, because context is everything, and you cannot understand what happened in Islamabad without understanding how we got there. The confrontation between the United States and Iran stretches back to the Islamic Revolution in 1979 and the subsequent hostage crisis, which set a tone of mutual hostility and deep distrust that has never really healed. For decades, these two countries have been locked in a cold war of proxies, sanctions, nuclear negotiations, and occasional direct strikes. The 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA, was supposed to be the moment where diplomacy finally broke through. It didn't last. Trump tore it up during his first term. Obama's careful diplomatic architecture was dismantled. Iran started enriching uranium again, and the cycle of escalation continued on an almost predictable schedule. Then came 2025. Iran's currency was in freefall. Economic misery had spread across the country. And starting in late December 2025, massive nationwide protests erupted across Iran, the largest since the Islamic Revolution itself, driven initially by economic desperation, but escalating rapidly into something much more profound: explicit calls for the overthrow of the entire governing system. Think about what that means for a moment. Millions of people in the streets, demanding the end of a government that has been in power for nearly half a century. That is not a small thing. The Iranian government responded with massacres of protesters, with some estimates from Iranian health officials suggesting as many as 30,000 people were killed in the crackdown. The regime did not blink. It did not negotiate with its own people. It crushed them, and the world watched. Trump watched too, and his response set off what has become one of the most consequential military escalations in the modern era. He threatened military action and began what would become the largest U.S. military buildup in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Aircraft carriers, guided missile destroyers, amphibious ready groups, the full weight of American military power moving into position. At the same time, back-channel diplomacy was happening. Talks in Oman, indirect negotiations. On February 25th, Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi said a historic agreement was within reach, ahead of renewed talks in Geneva. And then something happened that shocked the world. On February 28th, the United States and Israel launched joint airstrikes on Iran, targeting military and government sites, assassinating Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and other Iranian officials, even as negotiations were actively ongoing. Let that sink in. Diplomats were talking, and bombs were falling. The operation was called Epic Fury. It killed the man who had ruled Iran for over 3 decades. Iran responded with missile and drone strikes against Israel, U.S. bases, and U.S. allies in the Middle East, and closed the Strait of Hormuz, disrupting global trade almost instantly. Flights were rerouted, shipping lanes collapsed, oil prices detonated upward, and a fragile, complicated, bleeding Middle East got a great deal worse very fast. Now let's talk about what this actually means, because this is where I think the mainstream conversation goes off the rails. Most of the media coverage frames this as a binary story. America is trying to stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons. Iran is being stubborn and dangerous. The good guys are trying to bring peace, and the bad guys keep refusing. But if you step back and look at the architecture of what is actually being demanded, you see something more complicated and more disturbing. The Trump administration's non-negotiable parameters for Iran include completely dismantling its nuclear enrichment facilities, retrieving over 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium believed to be buried underground, ending all funding for proxy groups including Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, and accepting a broader peace and security framework that includes regional allies. These are, to put it plainly, the terms you offer a country after you have utterly defeated it on the battlefield. These are not the terms of a negotiation. These are the terms of a surrender, and Iran knows the difference. Iran's parliament speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf said Iran would not give in to what he called surrender terms from the United States, accusing Washington of sending mixed signals, saying the enemy publicly sends messages of negotiation and dialogue and in secret plans for a ground attack. And here is the thing, Iran is not entirely wrong about that. Because even as Vance was flying to Islamabad to supposedly negotiate in good faith, the Pentagon had reportedly ordered the transfer of an amphibious ready group and Marine Expeditionary Unit, as well as elements of the Army's 82nd Airborne Division, to the Middle East. When you show up to peace talks with one hand and you are moving ground forces into theater with the other hand, the other side notices. They always notice. There is also the question of Israel, which cannot be separated from any honest discussion of what is happening. Israel strongly opposed the U.S. Iran nuclear negotiations, lobbying against diplomatic efforts and threatening unilateral military action, a position critics warned could endanger diplomacy and heighten regional tensions. And it was not just a warning. While the Islamabad talks were happening, Israel struck more than 200 Hezbollah targets in Lebanon in a single 24-hour period. Iran had made it part of its negotiating position that any permanent agreement required Israel to stop attacking Lebanon. With bombs still falling on Lebanon in real time, how exactly was Iran supposed to reach that permanent agreement? The ceasefire that was supposed to be the foundation for these talks was being visibly, openly violated before the negotiations even concluded. This is not a minor detail, this is the core structural problem with the entire diplomatic effort, and it is one that the American media barely touches. Oman's foreign minister, Badr bin Hamad al-Busaidi, who mediated earlier rounds of talks, said in a March 2026 opinion piece that the United States had lost control of its own foreign policy and accused Israel of persuading the Trump administration to engage in a war with Iran, which he called a grave miscalculation and a catastrophe. The man who was in the room, the mediator who had first-hand knowledge of what was happening behind closed doors, said America had lost control of its own foreign policy. That is a stunning statement, and it deserves to be taken seriously, not dismissed, not buried beneath the headlines, but genuinely reckoned with. Because if that is true, if the most powerful nation on earth is being driven into a major war in the Middle East, not by its own strategic calculus, but by the interests and pressures of another government, then Americans deserve to know that. They deserve to think about it. Let us also look at what Iran actually wanted from these talks, because the framing you hear most often is that Iran refused to give up nuclear weapons, and that is why the talks failed. But that is a radical oversimplification. Iran's demands included an end to Israel's attacks against Hezbollah as part of any permanent agreement, the release of $6 billion in frozen assets, guarantees around its nuclear program, and the right to charge ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz. Now, you may agree with those demands or you may not. You may think they are reasonable or you may think they are outrageous. But they are not insane. They are the demands of a country that has just had its supreme leader assassinated, its military infrastructure hammered for 6 weeks, its economy pushed to the edge of collapse, and its people living under a rain of bombs. They are the demands of a government that is trying to survive, and survival is a powerful motivator. The price of Brent crude closed at just over $95 a barrel after the talks collapsed, having gained over 31% since the war began at the end of February. And analysts warned that elevated oil prices will have rippling effects on fuel and food across the United States, since high price levels are global and the war has disrupted supply chains including materials used for fertilizer and packaging for food. This is not an abstract geopolitical chess game. This is your grocery bill. This is the price you pay at the pump on your way to work. This is the invisible tax that every American family pays every single day, because the Middle East is on fire and the Strait of Hormuz is closed. The strait carries about a fifth of the world's oil, a fifth. When that artery closes, the entire circulatory system of the global economy strains and bleeds. And now Trump has ordered a naval blockade. Just hours after talks collapsed in Islamabad, Trump said the U.S. Navy would immediately begin blockading the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most critical shipping routes, saying no one who pays an illegal toll to Iran will have safe passage. Think carefully about what a naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz actually means in practice. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps warned that any attempt by military vessels to transit the Strait of Hormuz would be met with a strong response. The IRGC is not a paper tiger. More than 60% of the IRGC's naval fleet tasked with patrolling the Strait of Hormuz is still intact after 6 weeks of war with the US and Israel, according to the Wall Street Journal, with the fleet made up of small speedboats and attack craft equipped with missiles and mines that are harder to target than traditional battleships due to their size. So you have American warships trying to enforce a blockade against small, fast, missile-armed Iranian vessels in shallow, mine-infested waters. The potential for catastrophic miscalculation in that environment is enormous. And there is the Russia and China dimension that nobody in American media wants to talk about seriously, but which is absolutely central to understanding why this conflict is as dangerous as it is. Russia has reportedly provided Iranian forces with target intelligence and advice on drone tactics, while also benefiting from increased oil prices and authorizations from the Trump administration to deliver Russian crude oil to India. Think about that. While America is fighting Iran, Russia is helping Iran militarily and is simultaneously being granted sanctions relief by the Trump administration to sell its own oil into markets disrupted by the very war that America started. The geopolitical irony there is almost too dense to fully absorb. Russian President Putin told his Iranian counterpart on Sunday that he was ready to help mediate peace in the Middle East. Russia positioning itself as a peacemaker in a conflict it has been fueling, that is not clumsiness, that is strategy. The 2026 US-Israeli war against Iran has challenged the fundamental realities that have dictated the last few decades of Middle Eastern history. It has disrupted Iran's internal power dynamics and raised critical questions about regional stability, global energy security, and transnational terrorism. That sentence from scholars at Georgetown is worth reading twice. The fundamental realities have been challenged. Not nudged, not adjusted, challenged. What we are watching is not a localized conflict, it is a restructuring. The old order in the Middle East, the one that held, however imperfectly, for decades, is being dismantled in real time. And nobody has a clear picture yet of what is being built in its place. An advisor to Iran's newly appointed supreme leader Mojtaba Khamenei warned that Iran may target the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, the waterway tucked between Yemen and the Horn of Africa connecting the Red Sea to the Arabian Sea, and described it as being viewed with the same intensity as Hormuz. If that happens, if the Houthis, who are Iran-backed and still operational in Yemen, begin seriously targeting Bab al-Mandeb, then you are not just talking about one choke point under pressure. You are talking about two of the most critical maritime arteries in the world being simultaneously contested. The shipping disruptions that follow from that scenario would be global in scale and deeply painful in their practical consequences for ordinary people everywhere. Europe could face systemic jet fuel shortages if the Strait of Hormuz doesn't reopen in a significant and stable way within the next 3 weeks, according to a group representing over 600 airports across the continent. European airports are already warning about jet fuel availability. That means flights, that means travel, that means supply chains, that means the cascade effects that run through every interconnected system in a globalized economy. What we are really watching underneath all the noise and the rhetoric and the geopolitical posturing is a test of something fundamental. It is a test of whether American power, as enormous and as real as it is, can actually achieve the objectives it has set for itself in this conflict. Trump set out 4 military goals at the start of Operation Epic Fury: preventing Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, destroying missile sites, degrading proxy networks, and annihilating its navy. 6 weeks in, Iran still has a functioning government under a new supreme leader. Its IRGC navy is mostly intact. Hezbollah is still firing rockets and drones at Israel, and the nuclear question remains unresolved. The war has inflicted enormous damage on Iran. That is undeniable, but the political objectives that were set remain out of reach. Iran's parliament speaker Ghalibaf, after leaving Islamabad, said plainly that if they fight, Iran will fight, and if they come forward with logic, Iran will deal with logic, adding that his country will not bow to any threats. That is not the language of a government that is broken. That is the language of a government that has absorbed 6 weeks of American and Israeli bombing and is still standing, still negotiating on its own terms, still demanding concessions rather than simply accepting defeat. The gap between what the United States expects to achieve and what Iran is prepared to accept remains vast. And that gap is the danger zone where miscalculations happen and where wars that were supposed to be limited become something far larger and far more destructive. Short-term military operations may achieve tactical objectives, but long-term stability requires diplomacy, regional cooperation, and political legitimacy. Without such a balanced strategy, the risks of humanitarian crisis, economic disruption, terrorism, and broader geopolitical escalation will continue to grow. That is not an anti-war statement. That is a strategic assessment from people who study these things professionally, and it aligns with what history tells us about every conflict in this region. Military power can create facts on the ground. It cannot create political reality. It cannot generate the kind of legitimate, durable settlement that actually makes a region stable over time. For that, you need something different. You need a vision of what the end looks like that all parties can live with, even if none of them are fully happy. That vision does not exist yet in this conflict. And until it does, the pressure will keep building, the stakes will keep rising, and the American people will keep paying the price in 100 ways that never quite make the front page.